Here's a less well-known argument for the existence of God, the argument from Counterfactuals. This argument finds its roots in the philosophy of language, but we're actually going to set the stage by talking about morality. You see, there are different theories about what morality actually is, what it actually amounts to. Now, some people believe that the model called divine command theory avoids a bunch of the problems that other theories face, and so it's generally a good theory. Divine command theory, very roughly, is this idea that moral obligations stem from the commands of God. So, it could obviously only be true if God really does exist. Thus, the virtues of divine command theory constitute philosophical evidence that God does exist. Now, you may not be a huge fan of this argument because you might not be a huge fan of divine command theory. But we could all agree that if divine command theory was a really good theory, then this would be at least some evidence for the existence of God. Now, the argument from Counterfactuals is based on a theory of language called Divine Institution Epistemicism, as outlined in 24 or so arguments for God, and a lot of what you'll hear in this video has been fleshed out by Alexander Pruss. This theory is dependent on the existence of God, so if it can avoid some problems other theories may face, then it's going to give some philosophical evidence for the existence of God. So, let's jump into some philosophical language problems. I am holding a pen. I'm not going to drop the pen, but I could say that if I were to drop the pen, then it would fall. This is called a counterfactual statement. You can think of this as an if-then statement which describes a hypothetical reality. You see, the scenario described in the first part, the antecedent of the counterfactual, hasn't actually happened. I haven't actually dropped the pen. So this isn't a statement of fact about the actual world, it's a statement about this counterfactual world where the pen is dropped. This counterfactual statement is true because the description in the ending part of the counterfactual really does apply to that hypothetical reality. The pen wouldn't magically hover in the air if I dropped it. Now, counterfactual statements are used a ton in day-to-day life. If I were to take that route, I would be late. If I were to skip lunch, I would be hungry, and so on. But there's a very big problem with counterfactuals. Take the following counterfactual statement. If I were older, I would be richer. Now, there are infinite possible hypothetical scenarios described by the antecedent. There are some where I'm a year older, and some where I'm 50 years older, and some where I'm a decade older, and so on. And there are infinite hypothetical scenarios that all have me as being, say, 50 years older, but vary in terms of how much wealth I possess in those scenarios. So, some of the hypothetical scenarios validly described by the antecedent have me as being richer, and some don't. Thus, to say whether or not this counterfactual is really true, we need some way to pick out which hypothetical scenario the antecedent is talking about with those three words. Now, here's the Lewis-Stelnaker theory. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, by the way. Under this theory, the scenario described by the antecedent is the one which is the most similar to the way reality actually is, but the antecedent still applies. Now, the biggest flaw with this theory is that it's so vague. What exactly does it mean for two hypothetical worlds to be similar? There are different ways in which worlds can be similar, and it's not clear that we can create an objective standard to consistently compare the similarness of two given worlds. For example, is it the displacement of matter or the difference in energy which is most important to similarness? But beyond that, there seems to be examples where the Lewis-Stelnaker theory fails even when similarness seems easily defined. Say I have this stack of squares, and I say, if one of the squares were blue, it would be the bottom left one. This is automatically true under the Lewis-Stelnaker theory because if you zoom in and look really closely, you'll see that I drew that square ever so slightly smaller than all the other squares. So a world where any other square is blue would be less similar to the actual world because it would have more matter needing to change color. So this counterfactual is true, but for a very counterintuitive and weird reason. So, in summation, there's this problem with counterfactuals. When we say if x, then y, we need some way to pick out which hypothetical world x is talking about before we see if y is a true description of it. Now here's some more language problems that come from the vagueness of words. This is Sue, who lives to be 90. If we say Sue is young, this would be true to say at the beginning of her life, and wrong to say at the end of her life. But when does it switch over from being true to false? Is there a very specific point in time when it went from being true to being false? But then, what defines that point in time? Or take this example. We could say Bill is bald. This is false when he has a full head of luscious flowing hair, and true if he has no hairs. But if he has 3 scraggly hairs, is it still true? Or what about 100 hairs that are half a millimeter long? Is there a specific point where Bill's hair reaches a specific length and then, bam, Bill is bald becomes false? Having a super specific age or a super specific hair length that would act as a transitioning point from true to false for all these sentences seems a bit odd, but it would allow us to maintain a very useful fact about language. Properly formulated sentences are always true or false. If you don't have this principle, you need to deal with sentences sometimes existing in an ethereal state between true or false. So maintaining this principle would be very nice as long as our theory of language can actually shoulder it. Now, this principle might not entail that we always know whether sentences are true or false, just that they always are true or false. Now, here's the theistic framework that allows us to keep this principle: Divine Institution Epistemicism. Here's the idea. Sometimes I can make a statement using words whose definition I don't know exactly. For example, I could say a platypus is a mammal, without knowing what the exact definition of the word mammal really is. But there is a definition which has been precisely dictated by experts in the field of taxonomy. They have decided what it means for a creature to be a mammal, and I am employing their definition whenever I use that word, even if I have no idea what that definition really is, or who the experts are, or that they even have this authority. Now, according to Divine Institution Epistemicism, God is the ultimate expert of everything. So, whatever is happening beneath the surface that allows experts to define some words to some extent allows God to define all words to an ultimate extent. God has defined the word young with such precision that there is a truth about when the word would stop applying to suit and what exactly Bill's hair would need to look like to transition from bald to not bald. And, going back to our counterfactuals, God can define words so thoroughly that the description in the antecedent of a counterfactual picks out one specific hypothetical scenario out of the infinity of possible scenarios, which the consequent description either does or does not apply to. So, Divine Institution Epistemicism easily bears the weight of our shiny truth principle, and thus is philosophical evidence for the existence of God. Now, I am not in any way under the illusion that this specific argument on its own is going to bring any skeptic to believe in the existence of God. Rather, I think that the argument from counterfactuals can be one example of how, again and again, positing the existence of God can be very useful in pretty much every part of philosophy, which is really what one would expect if God actually exists. One final note. There's this age-old question. Is water wet? Well, the answer to this question depends on the definition of wet. It could mean that a large portion of a thing is simply touching water, in which case water would be wet. But wet could also mean that a thing has water as a separately existing thing on it. Water is not wet under this definition. Now, which definition of wet is the true one? Well, that's up to God, given Divine Institution Epistemicism. But there isn't a clear way to access what definition God has chosen with certainty this side of heaven. Thus, the answer to is water wet is the only metalinguistic framework that can make sense of this question is Divine Institution Epistemicism, which entails that there is a bona fide proposition with an unknowable truth value dictated by the divine will necessitating a fortiori the existence of God. That's the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content.